I am going to speak to you in two modules today on some aspects of Indian English prose. I think prose is one of the genres which is most neglected in our study. Everyone is quick to read a novel. Others like poetry because of the sound patterns which are available in a poem. And drama, because it is dramatic, automatically creates interest in people. But when it comes to prose, there is a sense that this is dull stuff and it cannot be of the same level of excellence as poetry or when fiction is written. What I'm trying to say is that even prose has a place, and in fact it has a very important place in literary study. When it comes to the question of Indian writing in English, which is the broad framework within which I'm going to talk about prose today, I think the importance of prose cannot be exaggerated, because much of the best writing by Indians is in prose. And this is something remarkable, because when the 19th century emerged and Indian writers began slowly coming onto the scene, it was in a particular social and political context. That context, of course, has to do with British colonial rule. English education in India did not really begin till something like the first quarter of the 19th century. At the turn of the century, that is when the 18th century gave place to the 19th, a number of missionaries came from England into India, something which was not in vogue earlier. The reason being that the East India Company, which had come to this country primarily to make money, to trade, suddenly found itself also governing the land. And in order to make sure that their governance would be effective, they did not want to complicate matters. They wanted to make friends with the local people. And therefore, whether they liked it or not, they had to show respect for the religious traditions, the cultural values of the people with whom they were engaged. And they felt that evangelicals or missionaries coming into India might complicate matters, because missionaries are notorious for wanting to convert. So in the 19th century, evangelicals and missionaries began coming into India in greater and greater numbers. And this was partly because British policy had changed. And the idea was that India should become the site for certain kinds of educational and cultural experiments. So Indians were guinea pigs, in other words. So they sent these missionaries in order to do two things. One, to open a number of small educational institutions in different parts of the country, where English would be taught as one of the subjects. Two, to open small health centers or hospitals so that the health of the people of India could be looked after. And of course, as you know, missionary activity very often works on the principle of education and health. And the missionaries became very popular, and quite naturally, a large number of Indians began slowly accepting Christian teaching. But this Christian teaching came to them to a large extent through the English language in schools and small colleges in different parts of the country. Around 1817, the need was felt not just amongst the British in India or the British in England, but amongst Indians in Calcutta particularly, because the Bhadralok Society of Calcutta was interested in modern education. And they felt that the old traditions of Sanskrit and Persian learning was not very helpful in making Indians become modern. And therefore, in order to create a modern consciousness, people like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, for example, argued that the best way in which this can be done is to make sure that English is taught in India. Now, English is not just a language. English comes along with cultural baggage, with an ideological baggage. So when you say I'm going to teach in English, it's not just a language I'm teaching you, I'm also teaching you some values which go along with the language. And so when English was brought into India, and Ram Mohan Roy understood this, he was not only asking for a medium of instruction, but also for the infusion of Western ideas of progress, of modernity, of nationhood, and a whole range of subjects which would make Indians modern and forward-looking. And one of the great letters which Ram Mohan Roy wrote was to Lord Amherst, where he argued that the money being sent down to India should not be used to teach Persian and Sanskrit, the two classical languages which until then the East India Company was promoting, because it was in their interest to promote the classical languages, because there was always a feeling that the upper castes and the upper classes which learned these languages would be of some use to the East India Company. Therefore, promote the learning of these languages. A good deal of Orientalist thinking with Sir William Jones and Colebrook and some of the others also focused on classical languages. Now came the conflict, and this conflict can be seen emerging in different ways, but the high point of it is in 1835. But before 1835, 1817 is an important date, because that was the year when the Hindu College in Calcutta was established. Now, Hindu College was later on going to be called Presidency College. It's one of the great colleges of India, and some of the greatest Indians have studied in that college. Ram Mohan Roy was appointed one of the governors of the board of directors or whatever of that college. And we had very, very fine teachers in that college. One great teacher was Henry Desrosiers, whose poetry you must have read. But Desrosiers was part of the Young Bengal movement, and he was a very great modernist, influenced by the principles of the French Revolution, of liberty, fraternity, and so on. So he was constantly teaching these children English, but also teaching them revolution. And so the parents of these children got a bit worried, and then they made sure that Desrosiers would be dismissed from the college. So Hindu College is important because that is where English education began to find a kind of local habitation and a name. But a few years later, when there was an attempt to start a Sanskrit college, and money was going to be sent, 1 lakh rupees. In those days, you can imagine what 1 lakh rupees would mean in terms of value. It must be about 15, 20 times what it is today. Therefore, Amherst, the Secretary for Education in England, got a letter from Raja Ram Mohan Roy, where Ram Mohan Roy said in very beautiful English, which he himself was so adept at, if it had been intended, he said, to keep the British nation in ignorance of real knowledge, the Baconian philosophy would not have been allowed to displace the system of the schoolmen, which was the best calculated to perpetuate ignorance. In the same manner, the Sanskrit system of education would be best calculated to keep this country in darkness, if such had been the policy of the British legislature. But as the improvement of the native population is the object of the government, it will consequently promote a more liberal and enlightened system of instruction, embracing mathematics, natural philosophy, chemistry and anatomy and other useful sciences, which may be accomplished with the sum proposed by employing a few gentlemen of talent and learning educated in Europe, and providing a college furnished with the necessary books, instruments and other apparatus. you can see that while this is a plea for English education, it's also a plea in English. And it does two things. It first of all tells people how important English education is for the modernity of India. It also tells you that, look, I'm able to write good English, and that's because I'm modern, because I have learnt English. So two purposes are served in this particular strategy. Some of our greatest thinkers were people who had a great feeling for India. They were makers of modern India. They were patriots, but they also believed that British rule in India was a good thing. In the 19th century, you can't think of too many Indian thinkers, and one thinks of people like Dadabhai Naoroji, the grand old man of India. He was the first Indian MP in the British Parliament. He represented a London constituency called Finsbury. And he later on wrote a very big book on the drain theory, where he argued that much of India's wealth has been drained away by the British. But that was a little later in his career. Earlier, he said, British rule in India is good because it is an act of providence. God has created conditions so that the English could come to India at a time when India was in such a demoralized state, and it is their rule which is making us civilized and forward-looking and modern. You had similar attitudes in even a man like Gandhiji. Gandhi took many years before he decided that the English were evil and they had to go from his country. British rule, not English people, but British rule was evil for him. And that was around 1917 when the Khilafat movement and other things came on. But until that time, Gandhi was a loyal servant of the British Empire. And he was constantly telling people, look, through petitions, through discussion, through argument, through parliamentary democracy, through debates, and through the give and take of argument, of civilized discourse, it should be possible for us to change the mind of our British rulers. That they should rule us, nobody is questioning, because they have done good things for this country. They have even created conditions for making us a modern nation, by bringing in railways and by bringing in posts and telegraphs, by their ethnographical work, by their ornithological work, their archaeological work. The whole country has been, in a way, created, given a certain coherence and a certain system. So there's nothing wrong in the British remaining here because it's good for the people of India. But what is wrong is that the Indians who are under their rule are not the same kind of citizens as people living in Australia or Canada or Malaya or some other part of the world where British rule continues to exist. So what is required in India is British rule, but also citizenship under the British Empire. And if citizenship is given to all Indians, which means they have the same freedom, the same liberty which an Englishman enjoys in England under British rule, then British rule can continue here. But after many, many years of this kind of talk, Indian nationalists suddenly realized that the English were not really going to do any of that. Because for them, there was a big difference between ruling their own people in England or ruling white people in Australia or in Canada and ruling dark-skinned people in India or elsewhere in the world, Africa and so on. So they were not going to apply the same principles of equity, of citizenship, of law, of justice to people here. The utilitarian philosophers of the 19th century, like Mill and so on, who believed in the greatest good of the greatest number, they felt that India is a good site for utilitarian experiment. But India is not ready for any kind of equality with England. So this is one of the problems which many of our nationalist leaders were facing. And therefore, you will find that even in a person like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, there is a twin, there are two things happening. One, a total acceptance of British rule in India. Two, a great pride in being Indian. And as Amit Chaudhary, in his well-known book called the Picador Anthology of Indian Writing in English, says that Neeraj Chaudhary and other people talk of this. It is a question of rejecting tradition, but also recovering tradition. One hand, there is tradition in India which is bad. Sati, child marriages, the prevention of widows from remarrying, marrying before the age of consent is, reasonably raised, and a whole range of such bad practices, bad educational system. All this needs to be replaced. We can't say in the name of tradition these things should remain. But it's also true that we need to recover from tradition what is good. And so Raja Ram Mohan Roy's writings, and in eloquent prose, is going to speak about things in India which are also valuable. And you'll find that the same thing happens in Sri Aurobindo, in Swami Vivekananda, in Bankim Chandra, and a whole range of nationalist thinkers. What, in your view, is prose? How would you define prose?
A prose is a range of statements, a range of sentences where one thought is being developed logically, and which has exactly a sequence. And there a thought is sequentially developed, an argument is being developed, and which has a proper conclusion. That I probably feel.
So it's a kind of a sequential argument,
yes, sir.
Leading
yes,
to
yes,
a conclusion.
Yes, sir.
And the words are chosen,
yes, sir,
in order to develop an
yes,
argument.
Sir. A craftsmanship is also being developed there.
Okay.
And we can find poetic statements. We cannot just differentiate prose from poetry. In prose also we can find poetic statements,
okay,
poetical reflections.
Okay.
Those things we can certainly find out.
You must remember that Coleridge, for example,
yes,
defined prose as words in a good order,
yes,
right? And he distinguished prose from poetry by saying poetry is the best words in the best order. Yes. I think there's something to be said for that, because poetry foregrounds linguistic play, doesn't it? When Wilfred Owen talks about the rifle's rattle, in that poem called Anthem for Doomed Youth, there is an alliterative play there. Or when Wordsworth says, "Oh, listen, for the vale profound is overflowing with the sound." These vowel sounds actually produce a certain resonance. So in poetry, there's a deliberate effort, if you see, at creating certain kinds of linguistic effects. In prose, perhaps it is not consciously done. It may be there. As you say, poetic elements remain in prose also. But there is a slight distinction, because I think prose is normally used for discursive purposes. And that's the point of what you said, that it's words put together in a sequence to create a certain kind of an argument which will lead to a conclusion. This is discursive writing, isn't it? And I think you're right. And fundamentally, I think you can't really make a very, very broad distinction between prose and literature or imaginative literature. Because in all forms of writing, and when much scholarship today speaks like that, Hayden White, for example, in Tropics of Discourse, is going to talk about language as a constant process of creation, of selection from experience. And so when you're selecting, you're already deciding that certain things should not be in it and certain things should be included. When you say history, for example, we think that everything in history is factual. But even history, as you can see, is his story, not her story. It is a selection from the past of events which suit a particular person's view of how the past or the facts must be interpreted. So interpretation is the basic thing here. So prose writing is also interpretation. It is a selection from language. And therefore, when we write in prose, we are also writing literature. That is why I was saying that much of the finest writing by Indian writers in English, and certainly this is true of the 19th century, was in prose. And much of it was discursive prose. Now, what are the subjects which Indian writers covered in their writings? Ram Mohan Roy, whom we have just talked about, is very clear about one or two things. One, he wants to talk about India's past not with undue reverence, because he also knows that there are many things which are wrong in India. Therefore, many of his prose writings will talk about the evil effects of some of our practices. For example, as you all know, he was in the forefront of the fight against sati. Sati is concremation, where from a mistaken notion of the wife's relationship with her husband, it was urged on all women, particularly upper caste women, and much of it in the Bengal region, to concremate themselves along with their dead husbands, because they felt that that would bring them bliss and heavenly existence. We all know that this is partly a material, there was a material reason for this, because if the girl lived on, she could claim a part of the husband's property, and the male members of the husband's side of the family were not prepared to part with the property when their brother was dead. All right? So there was obviously some economic reason for sati. Now, Raja Ram Mohan Roy exposed this. Not only did he expose the bad practices, but he also exposed the wrong interpretation of the Vedas, where by a slight change in a particular syllable or a particular phrase, a completely different meaning could be brought about. So modernity for Raja Ram Mohan Roy did not mean completely cutting yourself off from your past. You have to have your roots. And as you know, he founded the Brahmo Samaj. And the Brahmo Samaj, as its name suggests, is a Samaj or a grouping or a Sangha or a community which believes in Brahman, which is the ultimate reality, Brahmo, Brahman, the final realization of the essential oneness of Atman or the soul with Brahman, which is the oversoul. So it was a religious movement, but it also believed in purifying Sanatana Hinduism of all the unnecessary things which had been got into it. And therefore, you can see that much of the writing of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, and much of it is in English, not in Bengali. It's his mother tongue, but he's not writing so much in Bengali. He's writing in English because it is the language by which he can communicate with the educated classes of his own society, and more than that, he can communicate with the British ruling class which knows only English. So he condemns those aspects of tradition which ought not to be protected or preserved, but also at the same time says that everything from the West we need not accept. What we require is a proper amalgamation of the East and the West, of India and Britain, so that we learn the best things from there and fuse it with the best things in our own culture to produce a new synthesis. And this is done in chaste Indian prose, Indian English prose. You have similar things happening in Bankim. Bankim, as you all know, wrote a novel in English. In 1863, he wrote a book called Raj Mohan's Wife. It's the first novel in English written by any Indian. It's a novel which is an imitation of the Gothic novels of England at that time. It's romantic, it's sentimental, and it is too obvious. The plot is very contrived, the characters are very stilted, and you don't feel terribly enthused at the end of it all. He made a very big move. Immediately after writing that novel, he decided, I'll never again write a novel in English. And he wrote only in Bengali. And as you know, some of the greatest novels of the 19th century were written by Bankim Chandra, Anand Math, Devi Chowdhury, and so on, where he was trying to use his English education, by the way, in the Bengali language to create the new woman, to create a condition for understanding the inner space of India, which is unviolated by British rule. The public space has been violated because all of us are under the yoke of the British. But there is an inner space, a domestic space, which is controlled by the woman of the house. That is not violated by British rule. So there's a very strong and complex ideological construct going on in the Bengali novels which Bankim wrote. But while he was writing these Bengali novels, he also felt the need to interpret India to the West and to interpret India to his own people. And therefore, side by side with the Bengali fiction, and this is the funny part, he's writing fiction, imaginative writing in Bengali. But when it comes to discursive writing, English. Okay? And so you have the collected Bankim Prose, where he writes about Indian festivals like the Dolotsava. We just celebrated Holi, and Holi was actually called Dolotsava at that time. And it is supposed to be a kind of a great celebration of Krishna and his love for the gopis and so on. And it's become somewhat trivialized beyond, over a period of time. So he writes about some of these developments. He talks about the great myths of India and how, a primitive man anywhere in the world would have been only able to see the earth and the sky. And then he would think that the sky must be the father and the earth must be the mother, and they are married. So, imaginative stories which primitive man and primitive woman must have come up with create myths. When we have the eclipse, we say that, the sun has been eaten up by Rahu or something of the kind. But we all know that this is only an imaginative way of describing a scientific fact. And Bankim, who is a rationalist, because he studied in Calcutta University and he knows the writings of the great rational philosophers of England at that time, is able to explain Indian myths in terms which ordinary people can understand, educated people can understand, and he puts things in perspective. He's not rejecting the myths at all, because he understands that Indian myths are also important. A myth is an organizing principle. A myth is not just a false story. A myth, or a series of myths, organizes the experience of a community. And today, if we have something like a modern Indian identity, it's partly because of the myths and the Puranic stories and the epic stories which have given India a certain kind of character over a period of time. So those stories cannot be rejected altogether. They may not be true in the ordinary sense of the term, but they are real in a psychological way. And this sort of thing is explained by Bankim in some of his finest prose writings. I'll mention one more important controversy with which Bankim was involved. Some of you must have heard of William Hastie, who was then a very important principal and a teacher of English in Calcutta. He's the one who told Swami Vivekananda, if you want to know what is the meaning of devotion and what is the meaning of godliness, go to Dakshineshwar and you will see Ramakrishna there. He knows what God is. So it is this Hastie who condemns the Shraddha ceremony. You know the Shraddha ceremony? The Hindu ceremony where you perform certain rites for your dead ancestors. And the belief is that when you do these things very sincerely, Shraddha or through sincerity, you perform Shraddha. Okay, Shraddha comes from Shraddha, concentration. You are able to secure the happiness of 3 generations of people who are dead, and you're able to secure the future and security of 3 generations yet to come. So you're in the middle of a huge cycle. And the Shraddha ceremony is an extremely important emotive ceremony for Hindus. Hastie said, this is a waste of time, this is a complete superstition, you spend a lot of money, only the priests seem to be making some money. Bankim wrote a long refutation of Hastie's arguments against the Shraddha, showing that even though he is a modern man, even though he is a rationalist, he is able to understand the deep cultural and social meanings of these rituals and these customs and these ceremonies which the Bengali people with whom, of course, Bankim was involved, and the Indian people in general performing. So these are 2 major prose writers I've talked about so far, and I shall try and talk about more prose writers in another class. Thank you very much.